My name's Peter Cummins. I'm chair of the UK Personal Construct Psychology Association, known as PCPA. This video is part of a new series that PCPA is producing to demonstrate some of the contributions that personal construct psychology can and has made. I'm particularly pleased that Professor Harry Procter has agreed to be the first of our videos, which is going to look at the development of qualitative grids. Harry, could you tell us a bit about how you came to develop qualitative grids?
Okay, well, it goes right back to when I was doing research before I did clinical training at Bristol University. I was looking at the families in which a member had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and at that time there was a lot of interest in the literature about the kind of patterns of interaction and processes occurring in those families. So I wanted to test some of those ideas, and a way of making sense of these seemed to be very nicely, a lot of light was thrown on those by looking at it within the framework of George Kelly's personal construct psychology. Okay, right. So the qualitative grid actually, I didn't think of using that word until much more recently, but if you go back to the original dissertation, you'll find that when I summarised how each member saw themselves and each other in a sort of table, it was exactly the descriptions in that table came from the traditional repertory grid, in which you give people this form to fill in, looking at how they construe on a whole lot of different dimensions the people in their lives, and then you put it through a computer program, and the computer program kind of summarises the main ways that you see people. So I could take from that this summary of their perceptions of each other and themselves and put it in this table. Then I realised sort of later on I could use that table but without having to go through all the statistics and the maths, and just ask people and enter what they say into the boxes of this table. And that's what a qualitative grid, one type of qualitative grid is.
Right, because in some ways repertory grids have given Kelly a very bad name, that people think about PCP and think repertory grids, statistics, trying to put people's emotions into numbers.
There is a story that George Kelly was asked, wasn't there, that if you had to rewrite your Psychology of Personal Construct volumes, how would it be different? He said, I'd leave the chapter on the repertory grids out. I think that was, he was a bit, he found it disconcerting that people had latched onto the method but weren't looking at it within the framework. And from my point of view, the philosophy and the psychology and the therapy that comes out of his framework is the most important thing, and a very, very, still too unrecognised revolutionary approach to clinical and applied psychology in general.
Kelly called it personal construct psychology, and each of those in its own right seems to hint at something. What do you think he was trying to say with this title?
Well, the personal really goes back to his basic philosophy, and that is that everything can be construed in many ways, can be made sense of, interpreted in many ways, and each of us actually interprets our lives, our experiences, how we see people, how we see problems, all the rest of it in a very unique way. So you might say, well, we all grow up in a particular culture, in a particular language. And of course, language and culture constrain the ways that we understand the world very, very significantly. But Kelly still argues a little bit with the social constructionist camp, perhaps, that puts far more emphasis on language. He says that our constructs are there, and that language is an add-on, if you like, and that each of us develops very idiosyncratic, very unique ways of seeing the world,
Right, so, okay, so that makes it personal, but construct?
That's the personal, yeah. Construct implies that we actually do construct our worlds. I think that's in contrast to a very empiricist sort of philosophy, going back to sort of British empiricists who thought that, all our knowledge comes from our sensations. We're a bit like a camera, just passively recording what's going on out there in so-called reality. But what the constructivists in general, not just Kelly, but constructivists of various types, including social constructionists, they will say, no, when we apprehend anything, the reality that you might want to put in quotes is a combination of something that we're construing plus our own stamp, our own way of structuring and emphasizing and selecting aspects. Our own emotional reaction to it, again, is very idiosyncratic.
Okay, so I've got that it's personal and I've got that I'm constructing it, but why psychology and not therapy?
Psychology or therapy or sociology, I mean, this model actually covers a much broader thing than even psychology. But within psychology, we can say that if we take a framework that's very, very currently popular, of course, cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, which PCP is often seen as a sort of forerunner, and in fact Kelly influenced Beck, one of the important cognitive figures. Just remind me, hang on, just...
What I was saying was,
yes,
why
therapy.
do you call it psychology and not a therapy?
Yeah, CBT is very much about therapy and about the nature of human difficulties, which is included in PCP, but PCP is a much wider framework. So for instance, people use it in organisational work, helping companies to work well, looking at team functioning. So we're not just talking about a much more narrow sort of clinical field. Clinical is what Kelly emphasised. That was his main interest, but the philosophy and the psychology are much broader than that.
So it applies as much to you and I, whether we have difficulties or not?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I was very encouraged when I first came across that quote from Kelly, because he talks about repertory grids obscuring the core of what PCP was actually about. I've always struggled with the idea of putting people's emotions into figures on a scale of 1 to 7. How trustworthy are you, Harry?
Yeah.
And so when I came across your development of qualitative grids, that seemed to me to be a much better way to proceed.
Yes, well, I would prefer not to put these two, quantitative and qualitative, in competition with each other. I think they both complement each other, and in fact I could envisage a computer program in which qualitative grids are used and then integrated with the sorts of programs that are used to analyse quantitative grids. But you're quite right, most people, especially people in sort of busy daily mental health practice, for instance, or in education, are going to be hard pressed to use a repertory grid, which is an awful lot of work, and it's quite technical. So these are much more immediate, and I agree with you, they're much more close to people's experience, because you're just looking at their actual words, or in fact you can use drawings to, so their way of expressing themselves is directly reflected in the method. Perhaps I can illustrate that a little bit in an example in a minute. But basically, instead of putting numbers into the boxes of a table or grid, you can put people's comments from an interview. Right. So you might collect from an interview, let's say you were interviewing about my mother, and I used the construct trustworthy, because for me my mother was a very trustworthy person. Right. And so I would put in the box trustworthy. I might add some other descriptions of her, or some examples. I might add a contrast pole. I think we mentioned earlier that did we mention that this bipolarity, what Kelly, a very central thing, I think when we talked about construct, I was going to mention that Kelly made very, very basic that in order to make any sense of anything, any statement only makes sense if you're saying some kind of contrast to it. So if I just say somebody's trustworthy, I always have, according to Kelly, at the back of my mind, some and not something else. Right. Okay, so the obvious one with trustworthy is I don't trust them, but that gives us these alternatives. So you can, the quantitative repertory grid very much looks at these bipolar constructs and gets you to rate or rank them, as you've just described, on the 1 to 7 scale, or something like that. To get the bipolar nature of the construct, you can put it into the box. So I trust my mother very much, versus I don't trust her. Okay, and there might be some other people which come under the category of don't trust.
Right, and that's the first box of the PEG, how I see myself.
Yes, let me make it clear that the PEG, which we'll look at in a minute, is one type of a number of different types of qualitative grids. All of them involve paper and pencil methods, if you like. You could do it on a computer screen. But what they do is they map the construing, as we call it, the interpretation, the sense that things are making in a situation. It could be in a family situation or an interpersonal situation. It can even be applied actually to the internal world, if you like. Miller-Meyer, I think, was actually, you were a student of Miller-Meyer, weren't you? Who wrote a very interesting paper called The Community of Selves. Right. And the idea there is that we have a dialogue internally, and it's possible to put on one of these grids, you know, myself in a good mood, myself when I'm at work in an efficient mood, and to see how these different selves, if you like, talk to each other.
Right.
And that's a very interesting thing. You could call that a self-grid,
right.
Perceiver self-grid, something like that. It's a method as opposed to prescribing any content. Some psychologies say how we tick by telling the story about, you know, how human beings evolve or how they work. But what we do in this framework is leave it to the person themselves. That's seen within this framework as the most important. Right. In making sense of a person's behaviour, of their experience, we want to know what they have to say about it themselves. Right. So this, you put it into one of these charts, into one of these grids, and the nice thing about it is it has materiality, as they say. It exists in the world. Right. So next session, you can say, oh, remember last time you wrote down these things, that's what you said, you know. Oh, did I really? Gosh, I'd forgotten that, because actually I disagree with that, because people change, right. You know, or they come at things from a different angle.
I think we've probably talked about it long enough. I know you've got one that you've prepared earlier, as they say in all the best programs. Yeah. You're going to show us an example of a qualitative grid.
I'm going to show you an example of a perceiver element grid, right, to start with.
Right. Harry, you've mentioned the use of PEGs several times, and it's pretty clear that you've got one prepared that you did earlier. Yeah. What are you going to show us?
Well, this is part of a study that a clinical psychology trainee at Plymouth University conducted for his, research dissertation, and he was interested in looking at the relationship between boys. It's usually boys diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right, and their fathers. There's been quite a lot of work looking at the mother's relationship with the sons, but none on the fathers. And we all felt as part of this project that gender roles was quite an important thing. I mean, you could say that the fact that more boys have a diagnosis of ADHD is a genetic thing, and there may well be a genetic thing. I'm not saying there isn't, but it was also quite interesting to think of it in terms of, the gender stereotypes and gender roles that boys and girls have in those years, middle childhood, adolescent years.
Right. So you set out to talk to boys about their relationship with their dads.
That's right. Stephen Stewart was the researcher, and the example I'm going to choose is a boy called Aaron, who I think was 12, and he interviewed Aaron with his father. Each of them were given one of these perceiver element grids, PEGs. Right. The interviews were videoed. They then discussed what they'd written, and that was videoed. Transcription was made, and qualitative analysis of the transcription was made, in addition to the actual grids themselves.
Right. So if you slow down that a minute, we're back to the co-creation that we talked about earlier, that you actually videoed Aaron,
yes, and
his dad,
yeah,
and then the two of them together, is that?
Yes, I think I can't. It's a while since I looked at the study, but that's my recall. Yeah, that the main thing that the video did was getting them to discuss their two pegs, because each of them guessed how the other one would fill it in, as well as filling it in for themselves, as we'll see in a minute. It would be helpful, I think, to just clarify the way this peg, so-called peg, works by looking at a blank, the very thing that Aaron would have been given. Well, almost the very thing. I'll say in a minute how it differed from that. But if we look at this thing here, we've got the blank. So on the left, it's called a perceiver element grid. So the same two names, Aaron and father, are written on the left and on the top. Okay. On the left, they are the perceivers, and on the top they are so-called elements. This is a word that Kelly used for anything that that is subject to our construing. So any object of construing, if you like. So if I was a botanist, I would be classifying trees, and you could get me to look at the way that this family of trees differs from that. Here we're interested in how people see themselves and each other.
And so the elements are Aaron's family, and at the moment it's dad
just
as part of his family.
If you were using this in a clinical situation, he might say, "Oh, my best friend. Oh, shall we put your best friend in too and see
as another element?
As another element, that's a column, or as another perceiver. Row. How do you think your friend sees you and your father? You put another row in underneath and write it in, and that's the example of the flexibility that I talked about earlier.
That you referred to earlier.
Yeah. You'll notice there's an arrow there at the top on the left. That's to remind you that we read the grid from left to right. So Aaron as perceiver, looking at Aaron himself, and Aaron looking at his father. It's like the arrows going from left to right. Okay? Because sometimes people get it confused and think, oh gosh, which way around did it go? And that just ensures that we don't start reading it wrongly. Okay, so if we now look at the actual grid that he filled in, I just need to qualify here that in the way Stephen did it, the researcher Stephen Stewart, he gave Aaron 4 sheets of paper. You could use the little grid to, like a cartoon book with thought bubbles, but you can better give a sheet of paper, A4, even A3 paper, big paper. And he typed in at the top, you can see it there, it says, how I see myself. So there were 4 sheets. How I see myself, how I see my dad, how I think my dad sees me, and how I think my dad sees himself. Okay?
Yeah, so it's all the time from Aaron's perspective.
In this grid, we also gave father the same task. So we have 2 pegs, each with a guess about how the other fills in their bit. And then that leads to a rich discussion. In fact, I can say straight away they had quite an emotional discussion. Said, "I never realised that you thought that," and this sort of thing. So in this situation, if we start off looking at Aaron, his view of himself. Now, this diagnosis of ADHD is very much it's regarded as a very biological diagnosis, some sort of developmental disorder. The treatment of choice, unfortunately, I think, tends to be using amphetamine drugs, Ritalin and those sort of drugs. Again, in extreme cases, you might want to use those, because these girls get ADHD too, but they can be a real difficulty for both in the school and in the home. But when you look at what's going on for this boy, I think you want to start thinking, well, there's a bit more than just a kind of biological process here going on. And the very radical person might say, well, the psychological aspects of it are sufficient to explain these sort of difficulties. So this boy is a boy that goes into the playground at school, and he's labelled himself, he's identified himself as some kind of protector of people who get bullied. He described how a lot of people get bullied in the playground, and he would, you can see on his picture that the eyes are looking very angry, there's steam coming out of his ears. He writes in green on the right, he says, "I feel like ripping them apart." So he's very, very activated by these bullies, and very aggressive, if I may say. So, he says on his chest, maybe as almost like a t-shirt, he says, "I'm a protector."
Right.
And this is, if you think about it, quite a positive role, as opposed to, you know, other constructs that he applied to himself was, I'm ADHD and this sort of thing. So being a protector, it was interesting when his father heard that he described himself as a protector. His father said, well, if you're protecting people so much, why don't you protect your mother a bit more, you know? So he was very tough, the father.
Right.
That's reflected in the next slide, where he describes his father in two drawings. One is much larger than the other. One is dad on a bad day, and the other one is dad on a good day. And I would interpret, perhaps, I'd want to check that with him, but the smaller figure might mean that it's less often or less of an experience for him somehow.
But that in itself is a nice example of a construct. Good days, bad days.
Absolutely, very much so.
Right.
Yeah. And again, this idea of alternatives and almost choices. I mean, we have moods, all of us, don't we? And we can manipulate our moods to a certain extent. But that's a good example of how constructs aren't just sort of totally conscious decisions. They are alternatives that are, if you like, almost wired into our systems. So, you know, through the whole learning process, right through from first early childhood, we're learning to use these channels, as Kelly called them, in one place.
Right. So there's dad who's green, and then there's a second dad.
If there's a construct there, of course, this is in the eye of the son, Aaron. So Aaron sees the big figure as very angry, red eyes, sharp teeth. It says ogre written to him, so quite an intimidating figure. He described how his father comes home from work. I think he's a manual worker, and he came back with very dirty clothes, and I think that's what the brown marks are. On a good day, he describes his father as happy. And when he talked about his father in the more positive times, he said he really valued that his father was a teacher, that he would tell him the meanings of words and sort of that sort of explanations of things.
And now we're on to how Aaron is guessing that his dad sees him.
That's right, and that's what Kelly said in something he called the sociality corollary. A very central thing in looking at relationships from a personal construct point of view is that when we're talking to someone, when we're relating, interacting, or even thinking about somebody, it's very important that we construe them in the terms that we've talked about, maybe being angry or being an ogre or, you know, a protector. These are descriptions of people, what we call monadic constructs. But also, just lost my train of thought for a minute. Just say that again, Peter.
We were talking about how Aaron is guessing his dad.
Yes, that's right. So when we're judging people, we might say they're a protector or an ogre, but we're also judging how they think. We see them as a conscious being, a sentient being that also construes, just like I construe. So I'm construing the construction processes of another.
And in this case, I can hardly read what has actually been written.
And that's very interesting, isn't it? Because he's written a tiny little writing, and I think, if I remember right, it says troublemaker and destructive.
Right.
And Aaron, in commenting on that, said, yeah, my dad, it's the only thing he ever calls me, I think he said.
He's a troublemaker and destructive.
Troublemaker.
Right.
And then he went of destructive, which is spelt in his own idiosyncratic way.
Right.
He said, oh, my father's always saying that I'm breaking things and destructive.
And that's interesting that he's used pictures in the others, but then words happen to express what he needs to say in that particular
I can't remember if Stephen found out why the writing was so small, but we could easily speculate that he felt embarrassed by it, that he felt small with such a negative view from his father, that he perhaps felt a lot of pain about being seen just like that.
So in a sense it's a word picture. The words are there, but they're being expressed in a very tight, small way. And,
you know, I think that one of the emphases of personal construct psychology, as against perhaps, you know, there's a lot of complementarity with social constructionism and linguistic, you know, the emphasis on language so much. Of course, language is important. But I think when you look at very early construing, you know, when we're learning to manipulate the physical environment, things like up and down, and inside and outside, I don't think the words, you know, I think we're doing that before even the words are attached to those constructs. If you think about animals, they know how to manipulate space, don't they? Oh, that piece of food was over there. They go there. They don't know what the word left means,
Right.
of course, but they know to go left.
To organise it.
So that's a construct, left versus right.
And that leaves us with one final part of the peg.
Yes, and this is the Aaron answering the question, how do you think your dad sees himself?
Right.
And he draws these little pictures and he says, boss of the house. There's a picture of him in a sort of triumphal position, big and bluff, he puts next to it. And then boss of us, and that's interesting because the us included his mother. So we're talking about rather a gender stereotype here of a quite a tough, paternalistic sort of figure. And actually, interestingly, it's confirmed. If we, for a minute, we look at father's peg, we won't have time to look at all these, but if we look at father, how he actually wrote down his description of himself, it says, disciplinarian, likes things in their place,
Right.
punctuality is important, you should be in the right place at the right time,
Right.
and defensive too. So if you think of Aaron, sort of, one would get the feeling that he's sort of living in this quite tight, authoritative environment. You know, where if he makes a mistake, he's already talked about how his father calls him destructive, and there was another construct that he used that's relevant to that.
And so what that confirms quite nicely is that Aaron actually understands his father reasonably well.
Yes, yes.
Because his father's actually saying, yep,
Yeah.
I see myself
Yeah.
in that sort of way.
Yeah.
So there's quite a lot of agreement between the two of them that the dad is controlling, structured, likes things in a
Yes.
certain way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a really nice example of using a peg mostly with drawings, but a
Yeah.
lot of language
Some
involved
words
within
there
it.
too, yeah.
And we could summarize that then.
Yes, we're talking about the perceiver element grid, which is one of a number of different types of qualitative grid that I've been developing.
Right.
If we have time, perhaps in another video, we'll look at where we use time. You know, you can repeat a peg. I said it earlier, didn't we, that the peg can be put in at the beginning of therapy or later on, or you can have a peg for when you were a child, a peg for when you were an adolescent, etc. if you wanted to, you know, perhaps in individual therapy. Incidentally, these techniques don't have to be practiced within the framework of personal construct therapy. Any therapist of any school can use these. You know,
Right.
so if you were if you were using a very psychoanalytic model, you might be very interested in early experience, and you could chart these perceptions from early childhood just as easily. But you can also, as we'll see later, use the rows as time. So, you know, it could be early childhood, adolescence, and then filling them in a way that I'll explain later.
Right, but as you say, that's another complete story.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we should stop there.
Okay.